I'll start again. Welcome to this first online event presented by the Storrington and Arun Valley group of the Sussex Wildlife Trust. I'll introduce myself. My name is Lindsey. I'm the lead on recording monitoring for the group on the committee, and hence I've been asked to chair tonight's meeting. Just a little bit about the group. We formed earlier this year, and we've recently actually just passed a 200 membership, which is, I think, quite an achievement really for the year. We've already run a couple of outdoor events and 2 indoor events. We're currently working on a program of events for 2022, and we'll be publishing more details about that in the new year. The events include walks, meetings and presentations, along with potential monitoring and recording events and projects. The group's open to any members of the Sussex Wildlife Trust and is free of charge. However, it should be noted that most of our activities and events will be in the area west of the A24, stretching as far as Petworth, which is included in the area, and from the north of the Downs to the south of Horsham. So that's basically that part of the Arun Valley that we cover. As a group, we regard recording of wildlife as a key principle. It enables us to have a deeper insight into what's happening in the natural world and our region, for better or for worse. So it's entirely appropriate that tonight we've got Clare Blencowe from the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, who's going to be presenting us with our first online talk. Before we start the talk, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the format of the evening. I'm assuming that over the events of the past couple of years that most people are now fairly familiarised with Zoom. Just to say that there is a chat function. We have got a full house tonight, actually. It's going to be, ultimately, we're hoping there's going to be 100 people attending. So I'm asking that everyone remains muted whilst Claire's talking. And then if anyone wants to raise any questions during the talk, could you enter them onto the chat app, as it were, within Zoom? I think you can see it in the bottom. It should be in the middle at the bottom there. If you click on that, it'll come up, and it'll give you the opportunity to talk directly to the rest of the group and to anyone if you wanted to individually. If you have any questions that occur during the actual talk, can you put them up at addressed to everyone, and just write up your question? Viv and I are going to be monitoring that during the talk, and at the end we're going to have a brief Q&A session where I'm going to ask Claire some questions taken from that chat process. Okay, so if you have got questions, please ask them, and I'll see whether I can get them into the Q&A at the end. One last thing I just wanted to say before we start. I want to get a sense of sort of the experience and the relationship that anyone who's attending the meeting has to wildlife recording. And we're going to do this by conducting a short poll. Shortly, you'll see on your screens 2 multiple choice questions. And can you answer these 2 questions just with one answer for each question by clicking the button which is next to the answer which you think is most appropriate to the question. It shouldn't take long, but I'll give you a minute or 2 to answer, and then we'll share the results before the talk starts, and we'll see what people's response are. So if you look now, you should, any minute now, get poll questions coming up in front of you. And I can share the results for everyone. So here you go, let's see if this works. So how much diversity monitoring recording have you done before? And we've got 24% saying none, 49% saying a little, 22% saying quite a lot, and 5%, 2 out of the 41 people who responded, have done loads. I don't know whether Claire responded to that, but we'll find out. And the last question, the second question was, would you like to become more involved personally with monitoring recording? And 54% have said yes, 17% have said maybe, 22% not really, just here to listen. And to the final question, it depends on this talk, There are 7%. So there's 3 people out there, Claire, who need to be converted. Okay, so I'll stop sharing that. And now we can move on to the talk. So I just introduced Claire Blencowe, who is the manager of the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, and she will be now presenting the talk. Over to you, Claire.
Thanks, Jerry. Great introduction. No pressure there with the 3 people hanging on this talk to see whether they get interested in wildlife recording. Right, I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And I will put that on full screen. Go back one. Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming along tonight. It's always a pleasure to have a chance to talk to people about biological recording. And that's the subject of tonight's talk. I'm going to be talking to you about wildlife recording in Sussex and what we do at the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre. Yeah, my name's Claire Blencowe, and I've worked at the Record Centre for about 6 years now, managing a team there. And if anyone here is veterans of the Sussex Wildlife Trust webinar output, then just to quell anyone's curiosity, I am married to Michael Blencowe, but he's not going to be making any guest appearances tonight, as he's in a butterfly conservation AGM on the internet somewhere else. Right, so there's a gentle start to tonight's talk, and I want to just start with a bit of observation. And lovely image here. Look at this warty amphibian with beautiful golden eyes. That's a common toad. I bet a lot of you knew that. What's next? Oh, fabulous mammal. Look at those back legs, powerful legs for running, with big ears with black tips. There's a brown hair. Another fabulous picture there. It's a woodpecker. It's green. It's a green woodpecker. Normally I'd go for a bit of audience participation at this point and get people shouting out, but I'm not going to attempt that on Zoom because I think it will be a recipe for chaos. But what else have we got? Oh, some incredibly lush looking vegetation along a riverbank there with these really vibrant purple flowers. Looks very spectacular, but any naturalists who are familiar with our rivers in Sussex will probably recognise this as invasive non-native species, Himalayan balsam. Lovely butterfly there. One thing to note is the that kind of W scrawled in white on the side of the wing there, a white letter hair streak. And I think this is the last one. I'm getting into my favourite kingdom here. The world's most famous mushroom. I bet some of you know what this is. It's the fly agaric. And the reason I start my talk off like this is just to go back to basics with biological recording or wildlife recording, and start off from that point of it's really about observing the natural world around us, and noticing those features that allow you to identify species that you come across, and if you can put a name to these things, then just the act of submitting that as a record makes you a wildlife recorder. So there's a whole sort of load of different levels that you can engage with wildlife recording, and whether you want to do it a little or a lot or loads, as Jerry puts it, you know, it all counts, and it all contributes towards our kind of collective knowledge of Sussex wildlife if you just go that little bit extra to submit that information as a record. And again, if you've kind of got to dash off and do something later, I thought I'd get some key messages up front. There's a really simple system for entering wildlife records, and it's called iRecord. And the nice thing about iRecord is it's a really easy, free to use, easy to access system that you can use online on a web browser or there's also an app. So if you are someone who was looking at those pictures and thinking, well, I know that's a green woodpecker, I know that's a common toad, then this is a system that you can use to just bung that information in as a record, and it will capture information on where you saw it and everything else that's relevant to a record. So if that's the only thing you remember from my talk tonight, then take that away. It really can be that simple, and you could log off now and go and do something else, and you've kind of got a take-home message there. But I do have a lot more that I can talk to you about tonight. And the first thing I'm going to do is introduce the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre where I work. So across the UK, I noticed there's most people I guess here from Sussex tonight, but I did notice someone saying they were joining from Dorset. Across the UK, there's a network of organisations that are called local environmental record centres, and they exist to provide data and information services for whatever geography they're based on. And SxBRC, as we call ourselves, is one of those local environmental record centres. We're accredited by the Association of Local Environmental Record Centres, and really our whole function is to work in partnership with data users and data providers to make information about Sussex's biodiversity accessible. We are not for profit, and we are hosted by the Sussex Wildlife Trust at Woods Mill. And that's the sort of key information really, and you can find a lot more on our website, which is there. This is my team. So Henry there is my boss. She's the Wildlife Trust Director for Conservation Policy and Evidence, and the other folks there are part of our small but highly skilled team working with databases and geographic information systems, working with people and communications to keep biodiversity flowing, keep biodiversity data flowing, and make information accessible to the people who need it. So if you get in touch with Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, these are the people on the other end of the email. So another really key subject to touch on is why record wildlife, and I guess that's the question that those three people are looking to get answered. So let's see if that does it for you. And maybe just take a second now to think, if you're one of those, I think it was about 75% of the people in the poll just now identified themselves as people who have done a bit of wildlife recording, or maybe a lot of wildlife recording. Just take a second to think, like, why did you do that? And I'm going to take a guess at some of the reasons people might have got involved with that. And what we find is it's a whole array of different reasons. Some people are really motivated by that sort of practice of keeping a list, keeping track of what they've seen. Some people are really motivated by really just engaging with what they're seeing. Maybe photography is the main hobby, but through that you're observing what you're looking at and maybe putting names to things. Other people really driven by kind of nature conservation or scientific reasons for doing recording to contribute to some bigger project. And I guess what I would say about this is, from the Biodiversity Record Centre's point of view, any reason for recording wildlife, if you're submitting well observed and accurate information, we're whatever your reason is, we're 100% behind it. And the sort of key reason for submitting your records to the Record Centre is to add to the evidence base that we curate. So at the Record Centre, that guy that you saw on a slide earlier, Bob Foreman, he looks after a database that is dedicated to holding species records for Sussex. And that now has something like 9 million individual observations of wildlife that have come from people getting out in the countryside recording what they're seeing and submitting that information. And you might think that a record of a toad or a woodpecker or whatever is not a kind of key bit of information in itself. But when you put that together with the information that all these, then it starts to build a really important county. And this is a heat map. It's maybe the color scheme is a bit counterintuitive. We have discussions about this in our mapping team. But those sort of darker blue areas, they're the really highly recorded records, highly recorded squares, and the yellow records are the lowest numbers, and the sort of pinky color is something in between. So the geography we're looking at here is Sussex. You can see the South Downs, the Bowback Downs, cutting through the sort of southern side of the county there. And you might have a sense of where you live in that picture, and whether it's somewhere that's very well recorded, and the best recorded places tend to be nature reserves and places where people like to go to observe and engage with wildlife, but also some of our cities where people are seeing things in their gardens. But there's a lot of Sussex, the sort of wider countryside, and particularly the sort of wilder border territories on the edge with Kent and Surrey there, where we don't have a lot of records. And if you're someone that lives in one of those areas, then sending in information about what you're seeing can really help to build a picture of what exists in that part, in your part of the world. So that's the kind of information that we can generate at the Record Centre in order to sort of direct and inform people's recording effort. And again, if you're submitting your records, then you're contributing to this huge set of data that we have, and it probably won't surprise people to know that by far and away the sort of greatest volume of records in terms of taxonomic groups is for the birds. A lot of birds out there, flowering and plants and moths coming up second and third, but we have records for a huge range of taxonomic groups, and it's really amazing the sort of spectrum of expertise that exists within the sort of wildlife recording community in Sussex. But there's lots of these groups that are fairly under-recorded, and sort of focusing on those can help to really build up a picture of how they're doing in the county. Another reason to share your records with Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, if you're not necessarily motivated by just building up a picture of the county's wildlife, you want to know why. Well, it's because we exist to share that information with a whole range of different organisations and people, so that it can be used in decision making, planning, conservation projects. And this slide shows you the organisations that we have partnership agreements with. So we supply these organisations with biodiversity data every quarter, so that on their desktops in their organisation they can bring up information on where species and local wildlife sites are in Sussex. And why do they do that? Not just out of the sort of general interest in wildlife, but public bodies do have duties on them to have regard to biodiversity, and that is one of the sort of driving factors behind the need to have these record centres that can make sure that they are able to fulfil these duties. And if you're recording wildlife, sharing that information with the Record Centre, then you are helping these organisations to fulfil that duty and have regard to conserving biodiversity. As well as sharing information with all those partner organisations, the Record Centre also runs a data request service, and this is accessible to anyone who has a need for biodiversity information. So if you're sharing your records with the Record Centre, you're sharing your records with anyone in the county that has a need for biodiversity information. Our reports look something like this. You get summary information on protected sites and habitats and species. And the PDF documents that we produce for people are packed with maps and tables and information explaining what all these designations and different types of information mean. And just to give you a sort of glimpse of how much that service gets used, with that team that I showed you earlier is fulfilling hundreds of data requests every year. Much to our surprise, during the global pandemic, there was higher demand for the service that we provide than there has ever been. And over the last few years, we've seen a big increase in demand for biodiversity data and information, which I think is a sign of the pressure on our environment, because most of these requests are coming in from the sort of, I think maybe my next slide, yeah. Most of these requests are coming in order to inform the planning process and ecological appraisals, but also a range of other reasons. So it's only by making this information available that you can ensure that the fact that that species or suite of species has been recorded in a particular location can be taken into account in that context. And as well as providing all of those biodiversity data services, we also carry out a range of different projects. So we've been working closely with the local nature partnership and bringing together all of the different data sets that we hold in order to produce mapping of Sussex's natural capital assets and starting to map out what a nature recovery network for Sussex could look like. We've also done quite a specific project for Natural England, mapping mycologically rich grasslands, so making particular use of fungi records that people have submitted. And that information is also really useful to feed into our sister project, which is the Local Wildlife Sites Initiative, where we're refreshing the evidence base for all the locally designated local wildlife sites in Sussex, and species data feeds into the desktop biodiversity assessments for those, and also helps our surveyor know what to look for when he's going out to these sites to assess whether they still meet the criteria for being designated as local wildlife sites. So that's some quite technical reasons for why to record wildlife, but I thought it would be helpful to give you that insight into what we're doing with the information. And hopefully that will give people a bit of motivation to go that extra mile to submit any observations of wildlife as records to the Record Centre. And if that has persuaded you that recording wildlife is worth doing, the next bit of this talk is about how to do that. So there's some sort of the 4 W's. There's some basic components to what makes a biological record. One of those is who is making the observation, and you might think in the sort of age of GDPR and anonymity on the internet, you know, is that still relevant to be asking the question of who is making this observation? But one thing to bear in mind is that recording wildlife and identifying, especially when you get into more technical groups, requires quite a high level of skill and expertise. So knowing who is making this observation is valuable information for people who are reviewing and verifying those records, in order to assess whether they're right, and also know who to go back to if they've got more questions about the observation. What was seen, and that's in terms of a species, which you can use a common name or a scientific name, where the observation was made, and ideally a grid reference as well as a site name is really useful there, and also when in terms of date. And if you're recording different taxonomic groups, sometimes there are other bits of information that can be important alongside those, but those are the kind of real core elements of a record. Luckily, there's this system, you might have heard me mention it earlier, called iRecord, which makes it really easy to capture all these bits of information because it prompts you for them all in these little boxes. So if you do sign up for an account on the iRecord website, and you can, there's various windows to enter your records. You just need to fill in these boxes, and you can add photos if you want to, but you don't have to. And that will prompt you to enter all the key information. And then, press the button, and that's it. The record is submitted. And it also has this really handy tool incorporated in it. So you can type in the place where you made the record, and you can use this little map on the right to navigate and record quite precisely where it was that you made the observation. So in this example, that was a mushroom that I saw in the churchyard at Sayers Common. And it works in a sort of similar way on the mobile phone app, which again is free and available to use on Android and Apple phones, I think. So I've talked about iRecord, which is a really good general system for recording all kinds of different wildlife, different taxa. But if you're specifically interested in birds and birding is your thing, then we do recommend BirdTrack as well. That's developed more specifically for capturing bird records, and it's very popular with the birdwatching community, and is the favoured system for Sussex Ornithological Society as well to access records. So that's another one that's worth checking out if birds are your particular area of interest. Yeah, and I sometimes get lots of questions about this, and if you do have questions about other recording schemes or websites or apps, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we can maybe pick them up later. But there are lots of other wildlife recording systems available, and if you've got questions about whether the one that you're using feeds through to the record centre, then the best thing to do is just to ask us, and we can let you know, because we do keep track of all the different systems that are out there, or we try to. Right, so that I've talked about the sort of websites and mobile apps, and that is a really easy way for us to access data. But we can actually work with wildlife data however it comes. And here's a few different examples. We were extremely relieved to find out that all of those lever arch files full of bird records that got handed over to us in a big cardboard box, they actually had already been entered into the database by Sussex Ornithological Society. So we didn't have to take that job on. At bottom left, there's a series of notebooks that were loaned to us by the local entomologist Peter Hodge. The Record Centre, over a period of about 10 years, digitised all of the entomological observations in those notebooks, and I think they added up to about 43,000 individual observations that Peter had made, mostly of beetles, since the 1970s. So a kind of incredible data set there that was captured manually and entered into our database. We're very happy to receive data in spreadsheets. And again, if you've got some data that you'd like to share with us, feel free to drop us an email, and we can sort of work with you to find out the best way of sharing it. You know, the sort of closer it is to being in some kind of table or digital format, generally the easier it is for us to get in our system. But we're very happy to talk about data in other formats and how we can capture that, because it's potentially all really valuable information. I obviously thought I hadn't plugged iRecord enough when I was putting this talk together, but I guess the thing to add there is we have systems where every 3 months we download all of the data from iRecord and incorporate it into our database. So in terms of the kind of throughput of information, if you want your records to get to the record centre on the kind of fast track, then this is the ideal system to use. And what do we do with all of that information? So we sort of capture information from lots of different sources, and we work with several local recording groups as well, who collect data themselves and then share it with us on an annual basis. There's a sort of fairly substantial network of county recorders and local experts that go through and verify that information for us, so that we can make sure that the data that we're bringing into our database has been verified and contains good and accurate records. And then we pull all of that into our species database, and that's what we use to provide those quarterly updates to partners, and also populate our data request reports when people request those. And we also carry out data exchanges with national recording schemes to pull in data from national data sets as well, and also share local data with national recording schemes to help them put together the national picture of what's going on with biodiversity. So it's quite technical, and I think kind of one of how I see our job as the local environmental record centre partly is to keep track of all of this stuff so that other people don't have to. Right, so I've covered how to record wildlife. I just want to talk a bit about the wildlife recording community. And we're really blessed, I think, in Sussex to have a really vibrant and energetic and self-organising network of wildlife recording groups. And I always think there's really something for everyone here, whether you're interested in dragonflies or bees or mammals. All of these groups are entirely voluntary groups that come together in order to carry out wildlife recording, and some of them are also sort of active conservation groups as well. And you can find information on how to find them, all of them, on our website. So just to mention a handful of them, because I haven't got time to go through all of them. Oh, I missed this out. Also on our website, we regularly feature species of the month slots with information about particular species that you might want to look for in Sussex. And these are often written by experts from those recording groups. And we've got all the kind of back issues, I suppose, to call them, on our website as well. So it's a really nice resource to dip into and think, oh, it's November, what could I look for? Pillwood lice, something to do at the weekend. Yeah, so that's a really good way to kind of see the kind of species that those groups are encouraging people to look for. So one group that I think probably a proportion of people on this call are probably already members of is the Sussex Ornithological Society, really fantastic organisation that produces an annual publication, the Sussex Bird Report, and they also mobilised really quickly during the pandemic to put together a programme of online talks as well, which are available on their YouTube channel. So there's always absolutely loads going on with that society and various surveys to get involved with. There's the Sussex Mammal Group, and a nice project that the Record Centre did with the Mammal Group recently was produce an online mammal atlas. So you can go to that web link and see the distribution of records for various different species in Sussex. And it's interesting to see that some species that we think of as quite common, I've got stoat up here, but you know, species like rabbit, there are still areas of Sussex where we've got hardly any records. So if kind of filling in square bashing or filling in gaps in distribution maps is your thing, and you've got an interest in mammals, then it's well worth having a look at this atlas. There's Sussex Botanical Recording Society, another one of Sussex's long established recording societies. and they do a huge amount of survey work in the county. They're doing a project looking at village greens at the moment, having previously surveyed Sussex's churchyards for their botanical interest. And they also published a flora not so long ago, which is an incredible work. So much effort has gone into it, and it's a really great resource if you're interested in plants in Sussex. It's a fantastic resource because you can look at the distribution maps and discussion of all the different species that can be found in Sussex. Sussex Moth Group, my colleague Bob put together their website, and it's a really fantastic resource with information on all the different moth species that you can find in Sussex and what's potentially flying at different times of year. So really motivating resource for anyone interested in moths in the county. And Sussex Fungus Group, which is the group that I tend to spend most of my time with. Again, a really active group and getting into some quite cutting edge stuff with doing DNA extractions at home and finding various species new to Britain and things like that. And all of this in sort of pre-pandemic times, this whole community would come together once a year at what we call the Sussex Biological Recorders Seminar, and you can picture them there. It's a really inspiring community, I think, because most of these people are volunteers, but there's also people that work in nature conservation and ecology. But the skills that people have, you know, whatever their background, often people have developed just through their own personal interest and passion for wildlife. And it's amazing to see kind of what these people achieve when they work together, when they come up with projects and get people excited about contributing to them and sharing their records. So we're not going to have the seminar like this in 2022, but we are hoping to recreate some of the feeling of this community with some online talks and perhaps a face-to-face event in the summer next year. But what we are able to do during the pandemic is continue producing our Adastra publication. So this is produced by the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre, but the articles and contributions are all written by members of the Sussex Biological Recording Community. And it's a magazine that we put out every year, full of information on wildlife that's been recorded and people's natural history observations and reports on sort of ecological monitoring in different projects in the county. And those are all available free to download on our website, and there's a link there. And hopefully if we bring the seminar back in future, then we'll be able to bring back giving out hard copy publications. And if all of that sounded a bit too mainstream for you, if you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm interested in birds and mammals and dragonflies and butterflies, they all sound a bit too obvious, then there's also a whole load of different national recording schemes, basically pretty much every taxonomic group, from different groups of flies to beetles, spiders, mollusks. They've nearly pretty much all got a national recording scheme, so somebody who's collating records for those groups. And you can find information about all of the national recording schemes on the Biological Record Centre website. And this publication, we were particularly happy to be featured in Mollusk World a few years ago in an article about recording. And this talk tonight has been sort of focused mainly on recording species, but there are a whole range of different ways to get involved in recording wildlife, and I've just picked out a handful of national schemes that people might be interested in getting involved with locally. There's the Ancient Tree Inventory, recording information on ancient and veteran trees in our landscape. I think that system is managed by the Woodland Trust, and the information is accessible through their website. And we also, in the data search reports at the Biodiversity Record Centre, we include information on presence of ancient trees. There's People's Trust for Endangered Species runs a hedgerow survey. Oh, and this talk has lost a couple of slides that I meant to put in. But the other schemes I was going to mention, if you want to plug them into Google later, is the pollinator monitoring scheme, POMS, and also there's a national plant monitoring scheme. So if there's anyone on the call that's got some decent botanical skills, then it's worth having a look at the national plant monitoring scheme, because that's done on sort of randomized squares within the landscape, and asking people to go out and do botanical surveys in those areas to get a better understanding of plant diversity in the wider countryside. And I think we're getting towards the end. At the Record Centre, we put out a sort of occasional e-newsletter. So this comes out about once every 2 or 3 months. It's not super regular, but when we've got some news to share with the biological recording community. And if you would like to get these e-newsletters, then you can subscribe via the Record Centre homepage. And there's various other ways to get involved. I'll give iRecord one more plug with the web address there to sign yourself up for an account if you feel so inclined. If you want to find out more about those local recording groups I was talking about, there's a list on our website. You can find details for all those national recording schemes on the Biological Records Centre's website. And there's also a whole organisation set up to support biological recording nationally, and that's the National Biodiversity Network, and they put out an e-newsletter as well. So lots of potential avenues to follow up there. iRecord being the key one. And one last thing to mention is I've been talking particularly tonight about recording wildlife, and there's a sort of assumption there that you've got to the point where you've seen something and you're able to identify what it is as a species. Maybe you're not quite there yet and you've observed some wildlife, or you've observed something in nature that you're interested in and you'd like to find out more about. Well, if that's the situation, or if you've got any other wildlife questions, then you can contact Sussex Wildlife Trust Wild Call Service, and the details are there. And that is my talk. It was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'm very happy to take questions. I will stop sharing now and hand back to Jerry.
Okay, thank you, Claire. That was really good. Quite a whistle-stop, as you said.
Yeah.
And we're here at the end. I have got some questions that have been coming through, and I've got a list of them here, so I'll go through them. Actually, I'll probably go through them in order, but they are, and I've got one of my own I was going to ask about as well at the end. Michelle wrote and said, sadly, I'm only processing my summer photos now. Do you still want them via iRecord?
Yes, there's no kind of time limit on when to submit wildlife observations. Whenever people get around to sharing the information, we're always very happy to receive it.
Anne Griffith asked whether does the Record Centre hold ecological survey reports recorded from private ecological consultants?
Well, that's a very good question from Anne Griffith. And Anne probably knows, because she's been involved in this sector for a long time, that the origins of the Record Centre started with what we called the environmental survey database. So before we had these sort of dedicated species databases and habitat databases, we had a database that was specifically for storing ecological reports. And we still have all that legacy information of ecological surveys that have been done in the county. But what we've seen happen over the last sort of, I guess, 20 years or so, is there's been a huge kind of professionalization of the ecological sector. And there is just a huge number of ecological survey reports that are produced every year now for different projects and initiatives. And we found that it kind of wasn't feasible for us to keep maintaining an archive service for sort of all the different ecological surveys and reports that were generated through the county. So our focus now is on capturing species data and habitat data and feeding any information that's available through to our local wildlife site system. But if people do have ecological reports that have been done for a particular area and they want to check if that information has been captured by the record centre, then do feel free to get in touch. But we no longer try to maintain a sort of comprehensive database of ecological survey reports.
Okay, thanks. Good answer. Paul has asked, do you get records from eBird? Apparently it's becoming increasingly popular for recording birds.
Another excellent question, because yeah, Sussex Ornithological Society flagged this with us recently, that a lot more people are starting to use eBird as their preferred app for recording birds. And up until recently, we didn't have data agreements in place that allowed that data to be shared with Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre. But in the last sort of 6 months or so, we've worked with Sussex Ornithological Society and with the main contact for eBird at Cornell University. And we've just very recently got agreement in place for that data to be shared with Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre via Sussex Ornithological Society. So we are using eBird data, but I would just add that Sussex Ornithological Society's sort of position is that they would prefer it if you use BirdTrack, because BirdTrack is set up more specifically for the UK, and there are some things about eBird in relation to how it captures location information and the taxonomy it uses that are sort of not as, that make the data not quite as easy to work with as if you submit the data through BirdTrack. So you can use eBird, but Sussex Ornithological Society would prefer it if you use BirdTrack.
Just on the subject of BirdTrack, we've just had another comment come in from Andrew Armitage to everyone saying, I confess that I find BirdTrack much more user-friendly than iRecord, if I am using it correctly, especially now that BirdTrack has introduced the option of recording wildlife other than birds. I don't really want to record the same information twice. What's your response? Are your views?
So I need to double check what the current situation is, but there was a data flow issue for a while, that BirdTrack was capturing information for lots of different taxa, so not just birds, it was capturing information for other kinds of wildlife. But there wasn't a mechanism for those other records to get to Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre. We'd get all the bird records because they got sort of channeled through to us via Sussex Ornithological Society, but there wasn't a direct data sharing mechanism from the BTO that manages BirdTrack through to local record centres. But I know that people have been doing quite a lot of work on this recently, and I think certainly what the BTO wanted to happen is for those other wildlife records to sort of get transferred into the iRecord system behind the scenes, precisely so that people don't have to enter that information twice in order for people to access it. So what I will do is I will look into the situation with other wildlife records in BirdTrack, and we'll see if we can put something in a future issue of our e-news about exactly what the situation is with that.
Okay, whilst we're on birds as well, there's just one other question here that's come in from Dipper Murray, who signs himself as Edward. I've been monitoring a peregrine nest for the last 2 years, but have hesitated to record it on the diversity site in case it attracts egg collectors or worse. I'm just wondering whether, Claire, if you want to talk a little bit about vulnerable species and records that are entered and how they're protected in that sense.
Yeah, so particularly with birds, there obviously are various species of birds that would be particularly vulnerable to disturbance, and we have special protocols in place with Sussex Ornithological Society. So certain rare or notable birds, the information is shared with the Record Centre, but it only goes out in data search reports where it's needed, so that information isn't kind of shared publicly about notable birds, and it's not given out in the sort of general interest. If someone's requesting information for general interest, that information isn't given out. And the other thing is that Sussex Ornithological Society does have systems in place for flagging records as sensitive or confidential. So I would say in that situation, definitely share your records with Sussex Ornithological Society, and if you're concerned, they will be happy to make your records either confidential, so the information is known to Sussex Ornithological Society but not shared more widely, or potentially the sort of resolution on those records can be blurred so that you know, the risk to the individual birds can be minimized.
Okay, and that cuts across different taxa as well, doesn't it? I guess if you're getting records of rare orchids, etc.
Yeah,
still would be.
Yeah, some records, we have systems in place to flag some records as completely confidential. So, for example, we don't give out otter records. There's been only extremely occasional sightings of otters in Sussex, but they are making forays into Sussex. But because there is a very real risk of persecution of those species, we don't give out information that would indicate where they've been seen or where they've been present.
Okay, moving on to a slightly different area, from Phil, who's asked, can you give us some examples perhaps of where data reports from the centre have positively impacted on planning decisions for nature?
Do you know what? I think the short answer to that question is that as the Record Centre, we sort of fundamental to our mission is to act as an impartial provider of biodiversity data and information. So our job is to make the information available, and we don't try and track what the impact of that is or what influence it's had. But if you were to ask that question to one of my colleagues in the Sussex Wildlife Trust conservation policy team, I'm sure they could come up with lots of examples where biodiversity has been taken into account as a result of it being flagged up in the data searches.
I mean, my best example that I'm aware of was waterfalls on the Manhood Peninsula, and the use of recording to actually show that there were high numbers of them on the Manhood Peninsula, and that did affect developments that have taken place down there. There weren't previously many recorded, and I know there was a big push down there to make sure every single ditch was observed, and they came up with some very, very high numbers for waterfalls down there. Okay, question from Tony. Are multiple records of the same species at the same site on different dates of value? For example, if I see hedgehogs in my garden, is there any benefit to submit records each time I see them?
Yeah, this is a question I get asked a lot, and I'm not sure there's a sort of one fits all answer to this question, because it sort of boils down to what might people do with those records in the future. And I think if you're someone that likes to keep track of the patterns in wildlife around you, and if you're making regular observations over an extended period of time, then there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't submit all of those records into iRecord. And that information might subsequently be very interesting to you, because you might think, oh, well, last year I was getting hedgehogs visiting here over extended periods, or I was getting several, and this year I'm just getting one. And, you know, there are examples of, you know, people who entirely off their own bat for years have gone out and made repeat observations, or walked a particular route and kept track of what was going on that route. And it's only later, with the sort of benefit of hindsight, that you might find out that actually that's really valuable information. But for general sort of record center purposes, so if you think about how people are typically using the data that we hold in the record center, people are using it to determine presence and absence, in which case we don't really need those repeat observations. But you know, the fact that you have had those species present in your garden, just reporting that as kind of one occasion is really useful information, because we know that, you know, there's habitat there that is being used by that species. So, you know, just making one observation is also valid. And there are sort of monitoring schemes that are set up specifically to do repeat observations over long periods of time, things like butterfly transects and things. So there's all different ways to monitor wildlife, and sometimes it's a sort of case of finding out what suits you, what's convenient.
Okay, just coming back to the issue that Phil raised, which was about planning applications, and where data recording is having a positive impact on environmental matters. Michelle has said that I can say that data from weekly butterfly surveys at Friston Forest gallops is now impacting on and governing Forestry England's policies and measures regarding protecting and the conservation of the butterflies there. Paul asked a question as well, which was otters and other sensitive records. Presumably those records would be shared if the data request was for a planning application. I don't know how you would do that and keep it.
Yes, specifically otters, then they're shared for conservation purposes for people that are doing sort of otter conservation, but with them being species of river habitats, and also because their range is so wide, we don't give out the records in our data search reports, because if you give them out to one group, it's kind of, you lose the ability to keep things confidential. But we do include information, sort of very high level information in our reports, noting that we're not giving out otter records. But obviously there is also an expectation that if a development is happening, they will do the appropriate ecological surveys and assess what wildlife might be using that habitat.
Okay, Julia Harris has said that she's said it's an excellent overview. She's from Hampshire, so I'll look now how to get involved locally. I assume I can submit via iRecord.
Yeah, so iRecord is a national system, so you can use it anywhere in the UK. Just to make things really complicated, I think the Record Centre in Hampshire has a stronger relationship with a system called Living Record. So if you are based in another county, you might just want to check in with the Record Centre to see if they are picking up and using records from iRecord. But the majority are, I would say.
Okay. The other one was Paul asked whether you're monitoring invasive species, and if so, are they increasing?
Well, it's a good question. But one thing I would say is that at the Record Centre, we are just that. We are the Record Centre. So we hold the information that people share with us, but we don't tend to organise the monitoring schemes ourselves.
Right.
So I think there have been various different projects in the county that have at different times had pushes on monitoring invasive species. And there are some national projects that are particularly focused on monitoring invasive species. And we certainly provide information on what invasives have been recorded as present in our data search reports, but we don't actually organise monitoring directly ourselves. So I don't think I can comment on whether invasives are increasing or decreasing, but they're certainly a very present threat to the environment.
Need someone to write to you and ask you the question, I guess.
Sorry?
You need someone to write to you and ask you the question.
Well, I mean,
and then commission a report.
Yeah, we provide data and information. So yeah, I mean, if you've got a particular interest in a particular invasive species, you could submit a data request and we will show you what records we've got for those species.
Okay. I was just going to ask a question because I think some people actually struggle with using iRecord, and there is a difference between using the app and using it on your laptop or on a computer. I was just wondering whether you could guide people who are listening who may not be familiar with the thing is about the best place they can get information and ask questions about using the app or using the computer-based entry point for iRecord.
I think there is an amount of help available via the sort of help menus on the website. I did notice that Natural England we're doing some online training recently, and also the Field Studies Council's BioLinks project, they ran some online training as well.
That's coming up in January, theirs, I think.
Right, okay. So yeah, they're well worth doing, but we're also thinking about laying on more training ourselves from Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre. So if there is a demand for more sort of introduction to how to use iRecord and sort of biological recording generally, then happy to have a conversation about how we could perhaps address that. Okay.
Well, I think that's the end of all the questions that I'd picked up on. I'd like to thank you, Claire, for quite an enlightening talk and a comprehensive but high-speed run through the work of the Record Centre. I hope the three people who were depending on the talk have been encouraged to go out there and record. I certainly personally, and I think the committee are committed to engaging in recording and monitoring in some form or another, and we're just looking at the best ways that we can do that as a group. We are going to be looking at part of the processes, I think, of running the group is looking at subgroups and having champions in specific areas. So if there are people within the Storrington and Arun Valley group who are keen recorders, people who are experienced in wildlife recording and would like to become involved in that, we will be sending out messages to people and asking them to see whether they want to participate in helping us with some of those processes. So thank you very much, Claire. I'm going to unmute everyone now and say thank you, and thanks everyone being here. If I can work out how to unmute everyone.
Well, thanks for inviting me as well, because it's great to see so much interest in recording, and you know, it's groups like this that really help to get things organised on the ground, to focus people's efforts on where it's going to make a difference.
Okay, well, thank you. And it's now 8:10, but I'm going to call the meeting to an end. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Thank you.